Welcome to Employee Termination Tips. My name is Christopher Neufeld, Neufeld Legal. And in this particular video, we're going to be talking about how much wage underpayments and payroll mistakes can be with respect to individual employees. Now, I've always sought to slightly refrain from getting too much into this because even though I understand the concept, I know the materials based on my own clients and what is actually transpiring with respect to them, I'm sort of a bit cautious with respect to getting too heavily into it, absent outside third-party information. Nevertheless, as I've been doing research with my own cases, it did come across some interesting stuff that might be of interest to a lot of people when they inquire, what exactly are you talking about from a relative monetary number when you're talking about wage underpayments, when you're talking about payroll mistakes that impact employees? And how would it possibly be myself who's impacted? Well, first of all, it's not going to be that everybody is being underpaid. That's the first thing we've got to remember. And it has to be specific circumstances that have to be dealt with. And if those specific facts do not exist and payroll is properly calculated, there could well be no underpayments. The other issue is jurisdiction. A lot of it has to do with the jurisdiction and whether or not the jurisdiction lends itself to mistakes and errors by employers relative to payroll. Because if you're in a jurisdiction where typically there's not a lot of complexity to it, and payroll software, payroll practices are pretty consistent with it, that being oftentimes the United States or even the province of Ontario in Canada, there might not be so much of the underpayments that we're talking about. There are aspects, including in Ontario, where you can see there is a prospect for it. But where you're going to see it more so is you're going to see it outside of the United States and you're going to see it outside of Ontario in Canada. You're still going to see it in Ontario on different frames. You see the bank overtime litigation that's going on. That's partly related in part, though, to the fact that the banks are subject not to the Ontario Employment Standards Act, but more so to Canada Labour Code. And that's a consideration you have to recognize. But moving beyond that, when you look at the other provinces, that is where you have the greatest issues. Because not only are they different from the province of Ontario, but now you're different from the source of most payroll software being the United States. And that's where you run into the issues. Now, when we're looking at possible numbers, we're actually going to step away from Canada, we're going to step away from the United States. We're going to actually look at Australia. Australia similarly has done on many occasions, drawn upon payroll systems, payroll software and the like, and payroll practices that might well seem to emanate from the United States. I don't speak from experience, I speak from research and analysis. Nevertheless, recently, there's been a series of what the Australians call wage fraud cases and wage fraud class actions that occurred in the country where there were significant underpayments of wages transpiring. One of the biggest was with respect to a department store and grocery store chain known as Woolworths. And there they are talking about numbers in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, Australian dollars are quite comparable to Canadian dollars, are quite comparable to US dollars. Let's take it with that. And on a per individual basis, they're talking about a manager. How a manager over there, 5 years working over there in this company, could be looking at underpayments for 5 years of $150,000. So $150,000 in 5 years would represent an underpayment of approximately $30,000 per year. significant. Now, to give some relative objectivity on that, how much does a manager make at this company? Well, from our analysis, managers make between $90,000 and $110,000 per year. So what is happening is there is an additional 25% of their wages that should be compounded on top because of the miscalculation or the wage fraud, as they call it, that's transpiring. And the underpayments that are occurring because the employers are not properly following all the applicable laws. And that's that is considerable. If you would take your wages and you're saying that you get an extra 25% of those wages and that is what you were due. Now this is, every circumstance is specific and unique to itself. But what it does bring about, it gives you some relative understanding of how significant this can be. Because oftentimes when I'm talking to people who come to myself and are working with companies who we've seen are having underpayments occurring, they're not following the statute, the legislation as to how numbers are to be calculated in the province, what we discern is that there is considerable amounts of money that are outstanding and due to those individuals. And most people look at it and say, oh, what might be due to myself? I've heard about class actions. I've heard about these lawsuits. Am I due $500? Am I due $1,000? And the scary thought is, yeah, sometimes it's $500, $1,000 per year of employment. Sometimes there's an additional zero that's added onto that or more. So you could be looking at $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 per year of underpayments. That's year over year over the course of one's employment. So just as you see in Australia and as you see in other cases, there is the potential for considerable amounts of underpayments being done by employers, especially in Canada. Because the legislation, the employment standards legislation, is very demanding upon employers. Nevertheless, most employees don't challenge it. First of all, you're not going to challenge it, as I say over and over again, almost always, during the course of your employment. Because certainty is a difficult challenge to do. And the thing is, to challenge something like this, oftentimes, you're potentially jeopardizing your current employment. You could well lose your job over this. Or you get ostracized, or get drawn into a legal fight that can take a long time. Such typically tends to be only when you leave the job, when you're terminated, you're fired, or some other situation forces you to act. And at that time, it's appropriate to take that action. If you understand it in advance, when you're still working, you should be collecting materials, you should be speaking with legal counsel, you should be understanding that stuff. Problem is, most people don't understand this stuff. They focus on other aspects. They never look at it. The employers don't look at it. If they do look at it, they don't want to recognize that there's a potential for considerable cost to them. And that's why they're not going to change it themselves unless they're forced to. So it really comes about when you've lost your job and you're saying, what do I need to do at this point in time? Where am I owed money? And one of the major things that you got to look at is the aspect of wage underpayments during the course of your employment. And as we've noted over and over in these videos, and once again, and as you can see from other countries and other situations and even situations within Canada itself, there is the potential for considerable wage underpayment during the course of one's employment because payroll is so problematic in Canada. And the last thing employers want to do is pay more than they think they should. They try to pay less and hope they get away with it. And oftentimes they do. But if you're not willing to look at it, you're not going to find that additional money that you might be due. You might not be due. You might be getting paid correctly. But if you aren't, it's something you should address. Because at least from my own legal perspective and my legal experience, the more I've dug into stuff, the more problems I find, especially out here in Alberta. There are issues, there's inconsistencies, and they're considerable. And the reason they arise is because the law is very specific to every province. And the problem is payroll software is all too often not designed to meet those needs. Payroll training, payroll practices are not designed to meet that. Lawyers don't properly engage it. Lawyers don't properly know it. And if they know it, they don't want to pursue it in the way that's best for the employee. The employer wants to keep it as low as possible. They already think they're paying way too much for their employee services. And it's going to cut into their bottom line. Yes, it will cut into their bottom line, but that's what the law requires. But that is what you need to understand. And you need to understand the numbers can be considerable. We're not talking about minuscule numbers. Yeah, they could be small in some cases, but in other cases, the numbers can be quite significant. So given the significance and your understanding of it, you need to properly look into these things, develop your own practices, retain your documents, analyze them, work with knowledgeable legal counsel. And when the time is right, typically when you're out of the job with that current employer, then it's time to go pursue it, because we're talking about earned money. This is not some fantasy money, some farcical negotiated money that is not due to yourself. This is money that has been earned from the work you've done, and the law requires this payment. And that's what we're dealing with. So if you find yourself in that circumstance, you need to work with a lawyer. You need to ensure that you get the money that you're entitled to, because you've worked for it, you've earned it, and the law stipulates you should have it. The only thing is, if you don't do anything about it, you can be out of luck and you're not going to have the money. You got to force it through, and you got to fight for your money, especially where you've earned it. Thank you.